September edition of the Consortium's monthly webinar series, Leaders in Cognitive. Today, we're very pleased to have the chance to introduce you to Eliot Weinman, CEO of Trends Equity, publisher of the widely read AI Trends newsletter and other research-based reports on the industry. Eliot is also the producer of the AI World event, which debuted last fall in San Francisco and will be coming to Boston this December. Specifically, it'll be on December 11 through 13 at the Copley Marriott in the Back Bay. You can sign up for the newsletter and get more information about the AI World event by visiting aiworld.com. Eliot has been a participant in the technology industry at least since the last AI boom and bust of the 1980s. He's been involved in both technical development and market development. Trends Equity is his fifth startup and is focused exclusively on the artificial intelligence market. We'll be diving into some questions for Eliot in just a minute, and I hope you will be coming up with the questions you'd like us to address. Please use the webinar mechanism that Hannah described to queue up a question at any time. But before we start the conversation, I wanted to share with you that we're very excited about the partnership relationship that the Cognitive Computing Consortium has entered into with AI World. The consortium has been named the premier association sponsor of the event in December. The significance of this partnership is that the consortium will be offering its own one-day program on Wednesday, December 13th. This will be our first annual conference, and we thought it made sense to co-locate it within the full three-day program of AI World. The consortium program is titled Directions in Cognitive, and we are very pleased with the people in the program that we have lined up for our membership on that day. If you haven't already gotten notices from us about the advantages of member participation in this event, you will soon. The consortium program is designed for our members, people who have established careers in cognitive computing, and members will be offered the maximum discounted rate to attend the consortium conference. If you are interested and have more than one day to spend in Boston, you'll also be able to use that rate to attend other days, keynotes, conference sessions, special programs, and the exhibit hall associated with AI World. Unfortunately, we can't extend discounts for holiday shopping at the adjacent Copley Place Mall, but the good news is that you can go shopping at world-class boutiques without going outdoors, which could be a huge advantage of attending a December conference in Boston. But without further ado, let's turn back to our conversation with Eliot Weinman. Today, we'll be sharing perspectives about recent developments in the current AI boom. We'll be focusing on the recent emergence and sudden explosion of AI as a token for a new era of relations between humans and computers. We'll look at how the media hype, We'll look at how the media hype about the topic connects or fails to connect with the reality of the work on the ground, in research labs and startups, in established technology firms, and of course, in industry. Eliot, you and I have talked about living through the previous AI boom that attracted a lot of attention and investment to the field in the 1980s. Here in Boston, we saw the MIT computer science labs doing deep research in artificial intelligence. We saw MIT grads starting software companies to fill niche roles in an AI ecosystem. We saw some very large VC investments in companies who proposed to create entire new platforms for AI with custom designed hardware. I'm sure some of you will remember Symbolics and Kendall Square Research, among others. They offered proprietary programming languages, new metaphors for human-computer interaction, and a new concept of knowledge engineering for computers. On the West Coast, at the same time, seminal work was being done by researchers like Doug Engelbart inventing the mouse, and of course, the work at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center that Steve Jobs later borrowed for the Macintosh, and it is still the dominant metaphor today. So Eliot, when you look back at that earlier period of AI now, and the period of AI winter that followed it, what do you see as the major differences between what happened then and what is happening today?
Well, thanks, Hadley, and just want to say thank you for everybody attending the webinar today. As Hadley said, I lived through that period. In fact, I worked right in Kendall Square. I did research, was a research fellow with a combined program between BU, who is getting a lot of the MIT grads to come over, build their computer engineering and AI labs there. The MIT AI lab, which at the time Pat Winston was running, and a grant that we received from General Electric, where we actually worked on, interestingly enough, AI systems in Prolog and all the things you just mentioned, Lisp, and software trying to help and introduce AI at the GE Evendale, Ohio labs, where they manufactured the jet engine turbine blades, where I believe they still do. And what we attempted to do was build software to automate the inspection process by having smart software detect flaws on the surface of the blade or X-ray imaging of the blade. My professor was from MIT and then headed up the GE labs in Schenectady, in New York, where the CAT scan came from, and then headed up the labs over at BU. So he ran the program with MIT and GE and BU, and so primarily it was an image processing exercise. So just as a matter of background, yes, I was there, and then spent 3 or 4 years over at MIT and Draper Labs doing that. So we saw symbolics and met all the folks and went all to the events. And then subsequently went over to an insurance company, top insurance company out here in the middle of Massachusetts, where I built one of the early expert systems in claims and underwriting, and spent 2.5 years doing that. So, we do have a lot of experience doing that. It brings back, I think it brings back good memories. So I think that the difference, your question is, what is the difference then and now, other than the massive amount of excitement? And probably that existed back in the 50s as well. And I know it also existed in the early 2000s when I got back into it with my third publishing company, and we did robotics, RoboNexus and RoboBusiness, 2 big events in robotics, and we thought there was going to be a resurgence there as well, and that slowly died out. So I think that the big difference is that the work Jeff Hinton did over at University in Toronto 23 years ago, early machine learning, and what's happened now with deep learning. Neural nets, I remember, were being talked about 20 years ago. So in some ways, a lot of the technologies and ideas are not 2-3 years old. These have been around for a long time. And if you talk to anybody in AI who've been around this amount of time, and Hadley, this is not new in the sense that there hasn't been attempts by technology to overcome some of these big barriers. So the big areas, I think, obviously, are the recognition of the massive amounts of data. It's not to say that there wasn't a lot of data back then, but the machine learning and neural network software and deep learning that IBM show off with Watson back at the Jeopardy days and so forth, that makes a huge difference, obviously. And that's primarily what's driving this, in addition to the technologies coming out for image recognition, computer vision, all about data of all different types, whether it's video, audio. It's all at the end of the day converted to digital data, digital matter, which are zeros and ones. And at the end of the day, that the machine learning and deep learning software didn't exist to basically analyze and predict and intelligently be able to come up with recommendations based on data. But what didn't change, and I think is interesting enough, because in my show in November, we work with Park, actually. He talked about Park, and the CEO, Tolga Kurtulu, is on our advisory board and also gave a keynote there at the show and invited some of the companies that he's working with, and one of them was General Electric. And I was very pleasantly surprised because I was so busy, and his session was on the last day, that the people running that same lab that I did my research were there. They were not there 20 years ago, but essentially they were still doing the same thing. And when I asked them what kind of technology they're using, even after they gave the presentation about machine learning and the new ideas of taking data and helping GE do all those wonderful things they're doing in IoT with Predix now and so forth, he said to a certain extent it hasn't changed that much yet, because they haven't yet perfected deep learning jet engine turbine blade inspection. So some things are the same, and some things obviously are very different. So I think that the technology and the amount of money and investment spending by the guys, Google, Facebook, and so forth, and now the investors are making the big difference today compared to back then.
Yeah, that's a pretty comprehensive view. I'd certainly agree, although we did have quite an investment flow, at least in the Boston area, back in that previous era. I don't know if it compares to what's happening today, though. But let's shift focus a little bit to your work on AI World. I know you started to think about the AI market and what it would need from an education and event perspective some years ago. What was it that triggered your decision to launch that first AI World event in San Francisco last fall?
So 2 years ago, IBM was at the IT Expo, Gartner's IT Expo event, and made, everybody kind of knew what was going on at IBM Watson, but they did make a big splash at the IT Expo about somewhat of a pivot into the market, significantly strategally into cognitive computing and IBM Watson and the activities they were doing, because it's been well documented the massive amount of attention they received from the results of Jeopardy, particularly in the healthcare field and so forth. So, having lived through this and having just finished off another event, that we did, mobile commerce, what I did was a colleague of mine, who we partnered with in the early 10, 12 years ago, Metagroup, was actually Dale Kutnick, who's over at Gartner. We talked a lot about the impact that AI is going to have on enterprises, large companies. And, having covered that over 20 years in all emerging technologies from, back then it was expert systems and AI and client-server computing and cloud and other markets and shows that we've done and followed. It was very clear that there was going to be a massive impact. So we just thought it was the time to create a business, a publishing company that helped, independent publishing company that helped executives at large companies. There's the chasm that exists between the developers and the technology folks and the business people. That was true then, and it's true now. I know because I implemented technology. It's a lot of things that come up, and a lot of the things you guys are covering with the cognitive computing. There's impact on just people afraid about AI. Sometimes I didn't really even want to cover that at the show last year. But when, you talk to business experts about implementing some type of software that's going to automate their job, the truth is a lot of them are older and they're the experts at their company. And when I did that interviewing underwriters and claims adjusters, there's some politics there, and it's not lightly said. So it's a technology transfer issue. It's a ROI issue. There's a whole methodology that a company needs to follow, and they need to understand the impact. And most people don't sit around all day and research this stuff. So that's why we said, let's get all the thought leaders together. Let's get folks who are actually running AI and for companies like we have on our board, Monsanto and BNY and Vodafone, large companies who run their efforts. They came to the event, and they're going to come back this year, and they're on our advisory board as well as some of the other leading players in the market. And we figure out and how to develop a good program, an educational, publishing enterprise to help people stay ahead of the curve and help them maintain their competitiveness, which is a primary driver of what's happening from a business point of view now.
Absolutely. It really still, I think, works out to be a sort of a crossing the chasm problem that some of the folks who've been around a couple of decades will remember from Geoffrey Moore's work, that we're still in sort of an early adopter mode, and the sort of the proof of the pudding, the rapid uptake of adoption, I think still sort of awaits some proven applications and some low-hanging fruit, if you will. But I think companies have so many different pain points that it's a little hard for them to figure out where to start. It's a little bit of the dog in the meat house problem when you're looking around at all these potential applications of AI and you're not really sure how to get started.
Well, there's a clear bifurcation in the market. You have companies who are digital by nature, Google, Facebook, Uber, that started as a business 10, 12 years ago, that have clearly harnessed to, state of the practice, if you will, in searches, in natural language processing, with Siri and others. Viv AI is acquired by Samsung. All of these technologies, Amazon, what they're doing, even though people might say that it's not AI, the natural language processing and translation into text and then simple responses, it's certainly the beginning. And obviously, what the what's going on in self-driving cars is probably the epitome of what an AI system is or could be, and we that alone. So there's the leaders, and and then there's everybody else, right? So if you're a company like Monsanto or Schlumberger or a large company and you're considered a leader, what's going on internally at companies like that is maybe there's 50 or 100 projects internally in different data science departments all over the world trying to, figure out how to do this. There's no way are they scaling it to an enterprise level. It's still early on. Basic questions like, do we need our own data science team? What can the technology do? What are these startups promising? So these next generation large companies, they're starting to acquire companies just as Google and Facebook have in the past and so forth. And they're trying to, figure this out and implement it across their global platform themselves. It's a race, but the justification, and I won't say which companies. We just published some articles. You can read them on AI Trends just this week. But the justification for many of these companies is that 4 of the members of our advisory board came out of AI World, did a presentation to the board. These are boards of Fortune 50 companies, and each of them, in their own way, came back with strategic imperatives to lead and implement AI in different ways because there are different industries they're in. And they ran their own. Some of them ran their own events. We helped them run their own events internally at their company. We brought in basically a mini version of AI World to their company, and they brought in all their research fellows or PhDs or whoever is in charge of it globally, just to get a mass infusion of what's going on in the market. So it's a race, but as you say, it's still in the uptick. And I urge everybody. We partnered with Harvard Business Review, and we're doing something with MIT Sloan School right now. They just published, both of them just published different reports on AI implementation. Harvard Business did about 4 weeks ago, and MIT just published it the other day. And it really gives you a sense of exactly what's going on at large companies by reading this, if you want to know, and then come to AI World, and you'll actually meet the people and see what's coming up next year.
Now, I wanted to make sure to ask you, what do you think consortium members would be particularly interested in the the full AI World program that takes place Monday and Tuesday as well as Wednesday? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, well,
what people who already know quite a bit about the field would be interested in seeing?
I just want to say, you, as Cognitive Computing Consortium, developed a really great program for a one-day program, and a lot of the topics that you're covering and the initiatives that you started are complementary to us. So there's not a lot of overlap at all, what you're doing, what we're doing. I think our goal is very simple. Come meet the players, the first day in the morning we have Forrester that's doing an executive summit, so you're going to get a really good strategic view of what's happening and an engagement model of how to tools and methodologies and processes that you can use to facilitate and maybe accelerate what you're doing at your company. And then following the event, they're actually writing a special report, which all attendees will get a copy of. And then in the afternoon, we cover workshops and summits on. Have a half-day workshop on digital assistants and bots by a person who's Dr. Bill Mizell, who's written a 400-page report on the topic for us, covering every digital assistant and bot out there in the market. It's not just Amazon. There are a lot of companies out there, like AI startups, that have people themselves. The startups have specialties in particular areas, in particular industries. So you can learn about that at that workshop. We have an enterprise deep learning and a half-day program to give you a really big view of what's going on in the industry and how you can quickly figure out some working models for your business on which way you want to go, whether it's with a cloud vendor or you know, a software platform, or build your own, how you're going to build your own data science team, etc. We have a workshop if you're in the healthcare industry. We have a summit on AI in healthcare, which is we're working with the head scientist, data scientist at the LA Children's Hospital. He's very active, and we built a nice little half-day program. You know, venture capitalists are in the evening, talking about where, you know, where the next generation of money is going in, as you say, in the Boston area or California. You know, we have venture capitalists from all over the country. So we have meetup groups from the entire New England area that specialize in different subjects in different areas, whether it's data science, deep learning, neural nets, etc. MIT Computer Science AI Lab is going to actually bring in some research postgrads talking about some new AI applications that they're developing. I attended one of these last year. It was fascinating, brilliant people, and those are the people who are creating the new startups. And then on Tuesday, again, we have keynotes from industry, some of the, you know, best thought leaders that I could find, and experts, again, some of these experts running AI at these large companies, talking about the state of AI, what are the challenges they're facing, how are they justifying all of the questions that you talked about, Hadley. You know, a guy from Goldman Sachs, Heath Terry, that team wrote the best report I've ever read on the state of the market and who's what, and you know, they have a 200-page report on the price points, competitive price points of every product. It's amazing what's out there. So he's going to do a keynote. Executive VP of Dun & Bradstreet, who heads up all the AI efforts there. Like us, he's been around, and you know, I guess the best way I can summarize is when I talked to him, he said, Eliot, I'll speak, but I'll tell you one thing. Don't expect me to hype anything. And I said, you know what? That's not what we're here for. We're here for laying it out, and we want to help people understand what they need to get through to make this work. So that's the kind of, I think, you know, program and the networking and meetings and so forth that people in this industry, if they're serious, you know, they want to meet those people and they want to be around that environment. And we have this great AI tool, by the way, that's going to help people meet each other based on your social network profile. So we're trying to do some cool stuff there.
That sounds great. A bunch of what you said sort of pointed to another question I wanted to ask you, which has to do with, I guess, what we refer to as the skills gap. I mean, currently we have a lot of strong research activity around AI. You mentioned among the new tech leaders, meaning Amazon, Google, Facebook, but also Microsoft and IBM. They're sort of competing for researchers. We also have the academic community seeing renewed vigor in the computer science labs and addressing a lot of both old and new AI challenges. And, what we've been seeing is that the tech companies are essentially raiding the academies, stealing professors and researchers from the schools and also from each other. And then there's also been a flurry of acquisitions you mentioned, like Google buying DeepMind, for example, to leapfrog you know, some of the other competitors by snapping up some of the more advanced startups. So basically what we got is, and then this doesn't even talk about the GEs and the Schlumbergers and the Monsantos that you mentioned before, who are all trying to figure out how to staff up an AI effort within their own enterprise. So, so we've got this era of too many jobs chasing too few candidates. And what I wanted to ask you is, what were some of your thoughts about how are we going to get more talent trained, and how are we going to push this sort of talent market space back toward an equilibrium where there's at least some number of candidates for every job?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and it comes up in almost every meeting that I have with the companies themselves who's sponsoring the event. They look at the program and they say, are you talking about jobs at this show? And actually McKinsey did talk about jobs at our last event. There's two parts of the job market. There's the possible dislocation of workers from AI, and wouldn't it be great if you're going to be dislocated, you know, and I'm not a government guy, but maybe there ought to be some kind of some type of movement, social movement, or people who are dislocated actually get trained in data science and AI to help them get jobs back again, because obviously they can be useful. And it's a shame that technology is going to, although there are arguments that this big displacement is not going to happen. We don't have time to debate that here. I think you might actually cover that at your event. But I think that the universities have identified this. I mean, I'm really working with 2 or 3 universities that are asking me what kind of programs we should be putting in place for deep learning and all this AI stuff. And I think there's going to be, we're a great country, we're innovative. Universities get it. They're funded by these companies, so I think part of that is going to be a massive supply, I hope, in the next few years of qualified people coming out of school. I mean, if you can get a job now and you're 1 year out of school for $300,000-$400,000 at a startup, at an established company, or 10% equity at a startup, there's definitely enough room for those, for those salaries to go down and for the system to absorb and to train more people. The government obviously should or could help, not a politician, but wouldn't it be great if there was some kind of program, funding available to help us accelerate that, and students in school? But I think universities are getting it. We're working with local universities here, MIT and Babson. They have a great entrepreneurial program. So I think over time there will be some equilibrium there, but on the other hand, what we're also seeing by the players, as you mentioned, all these companies, the last 2 years, 3 years, they've set up headquarters out in San Francisco, which is where in Silicon Valley, which is why we did the show out there. But then I realized that I did the event and out there, and I said, well, on the East Coast, that's where all the enterprises are. That's where the big companies are who are implementing these. And so now Amazon is looking at doing some investments. Facebook is setting up headquarters. GE came to Boston, as you said. And I think Boston, because of MIT and the schools, one of the biggest amount of schools here in Boston, hundreds, and the work being done by these research teams are attracting companies like that. So Boston is going to be a big hub, and then after that, it's probably going to be maybe Austin or another city. And other cities are popping up, even Canada. I know Montreal and Toronto. They have special government programs to get software companies up there. So there's going to be some equilibrium over time, but I don't think it's going to happen right away.
Well, speaking of over time and looking forward, this will be the last question I've got for you, and then we should open it up to the folks who are listening. But I always like to ask about what your thoughts are about what some of the biggest surprises that we might see coming down the market in terms of the AI space.
Yeah, so I think there's probably just 2 that are top of mind. One, I'll just mention driverless cars because if you ask people in the industry how soon they're coming up, it's going to be tomorrow, basically. And we just published Dr. Lance Eliot, one of our writers, prolific writer, PhD from USC, been covering AI like myself. I met him 20 years ago. He was an editor for me back in AI back 20 years ago. He has a cybernetics lab, for example, out in LA, and he just wrote 50 articles for us and published 3 books in the last 5 months covering driverless cars. And if you want to understand the challenges of not building the car, but some of the technology challenges real life that the vendors are facing and the government and the regulations and so forth, I urge you to read those books because I always joke, I have, I don't want to maybe get sued here, but I have an Audi and the radio doesn't work all the time, right? So could you imagine, if your driverless car software doesn't work all the time, right? So we're all familiar with cars got little quirks in them. I mean, we're talking about, software that's going to, have to decide where they're going to hit in an accident situation. This is life and death stuff, much like AI in healthcare, and that's the reluctance of the healthcare company. So I think on that front, it's going to be fascinating to see what happens in that market. And then the other side of it is having lived through a couple of winters, and looking at the statistics coming out of independent research firms, anywhere between, growth, market size growth, up to from between, by 2020-22, some companies, reputable firms are predicting a $20 billion market. Some are $40 billion, $60 billion, and they all have different metrics and how they measure what AI is, whether it's software, services, natural language, blah blah blah. But not to hype anything, but I do think that there's going to be a cycle here where there's going to be a slowdown to a certain extent, a reality check. But then after, because I do fundamentally believe that technology works, but when businesses really figure this stuff out, and the companies themselves, the enterprise, software companies, 80% of them have built AI into their software. This is really a never-ending trend, and is going to maybe have a bigger impact than most of us would probably think, even within the industry. Something similar to perhaps the internet. So they'll be the two things.
Yeah, so sooner and bigger, sounds like. That's what's going to be the surprise.
Bumps in the road, and the bumps can happen in many different areas. Driverless cars, stories. There was a story of the MD Anderson cancer. About some of the legal aspects of this. We have a program at AI World, for example, with a company that actually specializes in helping Fortune 500 companies negotiate software contracts. These are $1 million, $10 million contracts. Well, what happens when you are negotiating a software license with an AI company, and it's no longer just software platform? Now the question is, who owns the AI? Who owns that? Who owns and captures the business rules of your business? Is it the platform? As some of these licenses, and there's been some historical precedents for this, are owned by the vendor, and that's why there's some kickback on actually using some of these big cloud software. I mean, it's a very complicated field, and having talked to the companies that have negotiated contracts in this space, these large companies, they have teams of lawyers, and there's no established law and case study right now for some of these IP and security issues out there. So it's very complex, and so it's not just as simple as, this AI market's just going to grow by leaps and bounds. I think there is a need for a good intermediary out there to bring people together and solve these problems. It's exactly what Cognitive Computing Consortium is doing, and there's other associations that are being formed now to help with standards and so forth. So it's just really at the beginning. It's going to take time, but I definitely think anybody in business really ought to try to learn about it and keep up with it, because it's going to impact their business and their job. And no better place to do that than go to AI World. That's the only self-plug I'll throw in.
Okay, that's great. So it sounds like it must be time to open up the floor, so to speak, to questions that have come in during the time we've been chatting here. Hannah, do you have some questions?
We have one, but it looks like it was in response to one of the topics. So, Eliot, let's see if we can make sense of it. It looks like the participant who asked it has left. So it says, don't you think one of the reasons is the computational capabilities of today's hardware, FPGA, GPU, HPC, etc.? I'm just not sure what question that refers to.
So I'll just say something, really quickly, because we talk to all of the HPC companies. We actually have sessions covering that at the event, obviously. AI really, the kind of work being done by businesses and in AI and all this data could not be possible, frankly, without GPUs and the kind of technology that NVIDIA and other competitors are racing to get to, because it used to take days, to run data intelligently through neural nets and so forth. So I don't know what the question was, but I think it's clear that the hardware enablement is one of the critical aspects of, and without it, same thing with IoT, generally speaking, there really cannot be any Internet of Things or without AI, right? So you can't have AI without, yeah, you can have some chips at the local edge and so forth, and that maybe not, you don't maybe need a HP, you do need an HPC chip, but to most of the work cannot be done with neural nets and so forth without the technology that companies like NVIDIA have developed.
Yeah, I think maybe the question might have gone to the fact that we didn't explicitly mention as an enabler, sort of when we were talking about the development of the field and how machine learning, is really an old, old set of ideas and even old sets of code. But one of the reasons it didn't succeed the first time around, or the second time around for that matter, is the lack of this kind of high performance processing capability. So I think it was a good question. I mean, yes,
yeah, it was.
we wouldn't be going here without it.
Yeah, if you had high-performance computing, there were some other software, there was symbolics on other machines. The problem is you didn't have machine learning and deep learning algorithms, too. So absolutely, there's no question about it. This entire industry is being enabled by HPC.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions coming in. Or any hands raised, but we do have time. If anyone in the audience has a question, please feel free to type it in now. Oh, it looks like Sue has a question. So Eliot, can you tell us how people are beginning their cognitive/AO projects? What do you think about first?
About first? Sorry.
I probably should have said that better. So the question is, can you tell us how people are beginning their cognitive/AI projects, and what do you think about first?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, what we're seeing in discussions with these companies who have gone through, for example, a year or two, obviously there's a deep entrenchment in the market to understand all the technologies available, using external resources, opinions. If you're a large company, opinions from some of the leading systems integrators, because they're usually working with some of these companies anyway. And then the next thing is trying to, it depends on their strategic imperative, but if it's an imperative to explore and innovate, is trying to narrow down the types of applications. And one thought process is coming up with prototype applications in specific areas that have a high probability to succeed, and that you can ensure that success internally with either working with someone or building you have your own data science team and working with the business units. And if it doesn't work, if you don't see success within a few months, kind of give it up and move on to the next type of application. So there's some really good research out there and information to help companies identify specific areas and applications that they want to target. So that's one way of going about it. That seems to be a little bit generally where companies are now. And maybe some of these advanced companies that have run by, let's say, PhDs in data, who are chief data officers, maybe they're a little bit more aggressive, and they are, enabling, for example, Uber. Danny Lang used to be there. He's over at Unity. When I speak with him, while he was at Uber, he enabled the business units, people themselves. 35% of the workforce at Uber were able to use the technology that he deployed. So that actually was an application, an AI application that end users in the business will use, 35% of the employees. Of course, they're a digital company, not as easy as some of the legacy companies. So you want to embrace that with the business and have the business actively involved, and also deal with some of these technology transfer issues, but work with and increase your chance for success. And that's what the companies, I think, are trying to do. there's a wide spectrum of that, but I think if you look at the research and the studies coming back from some of these reports, I've said everybody, 80% of companies believe it's strategic, but maybe only 15% are actually doing it today. So that means that from a majority of those are still, have multiple projects going on, and they want wins, and if they can see some big wins, then they're going to build on that.
Great, thank you. We have another question, which is, which AI startups will be presenting at AI World?
Okay, well, we have an AI startup lightning panel where there's a number of companies which was very successful, where we have a gentleman who's been a startup advisor for 40 companies, Steve Ardire, and he puts together a panel with 6 or 8 companies right there. And talks about, what they're doing explicitly. There's a startup pavilion where right now we have around 12. We'll probably end up with about 15 or 20 companies that will be there that you can meet with specific startups. As I said, the MIT AI Lab will have pre-startups. There'll be about 4 or 5 people on that panel. Some of them might even start their first round of funding right around that time. And then if you look at the conference program, you'll see there's a number of companies there, Octane AI, just a number of speakers. We have about 110 speakers right now. I'd say at least 15% of those are unique startups. So about 35 companies you'll be able to meet and talk to.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions coming through. So Hadley, unless you have any other questions or thoughts, we can probably wrap up this session.
Okay, I just wanted to thank Eliot for his time and the work that goes into putting a sort of an industry integrating event like this. It takes a lot of work, and we appreciate it, and we're very much looking forward to joining you in December.
Yes, thanks Hadley, and thank again everybody participating in the webinar. We run our own webinars. We have 5 or 6 more coming up, so just subscribe to AI Trends and you'll get on our newsletters and get updated on what's going on with the event. So thank you, Hadley and Hannah.
Yes, and thanks for all of you for joining. This session has been recorded and will be available on the Cognitive Computing Consortium website as well under webinars. So please feel free to listen to it if you couldn't attend the entire session. We look forward to seeing all of you next month.